Polygenic traits are really no harder than simple Mendelian inheritance patterns. If you know how to work a Mendelian Punnett square, you should be able to do a multiple trait situation just as easily, because really it's just Mendelian Punnett squares done more than one time, and then the odds are multiplied together. If you're not confident with Mendelian crosses, you should go back and look at the basic Punnett square videos. But if you're okay with those, then I'm going to show you how to do the multiplication rule, and this will help you when you're trying to figure out the odds of inheriting two different traits in one individual, or a polygenic trait, which includes most of the traits that you can observe in a human, like height or skin color or eye color or hair color, which is why we get this wide variation in the types of those traits that we see. So let me give you an example problem. Imagine a bird whose feather color is controlled by two different proteins that we'll call protein A and protein B. So presumably if it's two different proteins, you would have two different genes that tell your cells how to make these proteins. If the bird expresses the dominant form of protein A but the recessive form of protein B, the bird's feathers will be blue. If the bird expresses the recessive form of protein A but the dominant form of protein B, the feathers will be green. And if the bird expresses the dominant form for both A and B, we're going to end up with a bird that has yellow feathers. And finally, if it's expressing the recessive form of both genes A and B, it's going to be red. So there's my setup. All of these different birds are all the same species of bird. They just end up with different feather colors depending on which version of gene A and gene B they inherit. So what are the chances that with that setup, what are the chances that the following birds would produce yellow offspring? We're going to say that mom has a genotype that gene A is homozygous dominant, and genotype of gene B is that she's heterozygous. And then the dad bird, gene A, he's heterozygous, and gene B, he's homozygous recessive. And if you remember in my setup from the last slide, that would mean that mom is a yellow bird and dad is a blue bird, if we're looking at their phenotypes. Yeah, because if you express both dominant, you end up being a yellow bird. If you express the dominant version, he'd have a dominant A, and then he'd have a recessive B. That would make him a blue bird in his phenotype. So in order to work this problem, I need that information from the first slide. I need to know the parents' genotypes, and then I start drawing some Punnett squares. So, if we're looking at two different genes, we'll need one Punnett square for gene A, and we'll need a second one for gene B. Draw the Punnett square just like we did for a normal Mendelian trait. Same deal over here. I'm going to fill in mom's alleles first, and so I need to go look at mom. Her genotype for gene A is homozygous dominant, so to represent that I'll put two capital letter A's to represent mom's two alleles. She's homozygous, meaning two of the same, and they're dominant, so they're both capitals. And dad for type A, for gene A, his genotype is heterozygous, so he would have, hetero means one of each, so he'd have a big A and a little a. That square is ready to roll. Now let's go over to gene B. For gene B, mom is heterozygous, that means she would have one of each. Dad is homozygous recessive, so he'd have, that was not a very good B. Let's try that again. He'd have a little b and a little b. And now we go and we do the cross. So when these parents go to make babies, dad could give it big A, mom could give little a. Big A is a possibility. Big A with a little a is a possibility. Or we could do this big A with that little a, and we'd end up with this last possibility of how their alleles could combine when they do sexual reproduction. With this one over here, we could have mom giving that big B and dad giving that little b, and we'd end up with this individual. Or we could have mom contributing little b and dad contributing little b, and we'd end up with this individual. And just fill out the square. There we go. Next step, we need to interpret what our squares mean. So, in this one over here, every one of these offspring are exhibiting the dominant version of the gene. And remember our original question, what are the odds of getting yellow offspring? Well, if it expresses the dominant form of gene A and gene B, it's going to be yellow. So we're worried about getting dominant genes expressed here, and the odds of that happening in our first Punnett square, that would be a 4 out of 4 chance. No matter which way the alleles combine during sexual reproduction, they're going to end up with a dominant version of gene A. We also, to get a yellow bird, would need to be expressing the dominant version of gene B. So if I look over here, this individual would express gene B, the dominant version of gene B. This individual would express the dominant version of gene B and ignore this recessive version. But these individuals don't have a dominant B to read, so they would not express the dominant version of gene B. They'd have to express whatever the recessive version was. So that gives us a ratio of these two expressing it, these two not. So our odds of expressing dominant B would be 2 out of the 4 different ways these alleles could combine. Now to figure out the total odds of getting the dominant version of gene A expressed and the dominant version of gene B expressed, we just take our calculated odds, this 4 out of 4, and multiply it by this 2 out of 4, which shouldn't be too terribly hard. 4 out of 4, I know that's equal to 1, but just to make sure that we review how to multiply a fraction, because you wouldn't believe it, but I still get people that have a rough time with that. You just multiply across, so 4 by 2 is 8, and 4 by 4 is 16, which reduces to 1/2. And really what that half means is half, 1/2 chance of yellow offspring. Yellow bird kids. So that's how we would work that problem. Practice problem number 2. This time we're going to cross 2 yellow birds, and we're going to say that both of these parents are heterozygous for gene A and gene B. So this one's genotype would be big A little a and big B little b, or heterozygous for both genes. And same with this one. Here are my questions about these birds then. So we've got, if 2 yellow birds mate and they're both heterozygous for gene A and gene B, what are the chances of producing yellow, green, blue, and red offspring? So I'm going to work this problem. I'll leave the question up here in the corner that we're trying to answer. And we also need to know what genotypes we would need to get these 4 different birds. So I'll leave that up here in this corner because we'll need that information in a little bit. And I'll show you how to work this out. So, since we're worried about 2 different genes, we will need 2 different Punnett squares. So let's start over here. Okay, and we said that both parents were heterozygous for gene A. So I'll put the mom bird's genes up there, and I'll put the dad bird's genes here, the 2 different alleles they have for gene A and the 2 different alleles they have for the 2 different alleles that the other parent has for gene A. And then right next door over here, I'll do a second Punnett square showing gene B. And again, they're heterozygous for gene B as well, because I told you that in the setup of the problem. Then I do the cross, so mom could give this gene A and dad could give that gene A. We'd end up with big A, or homozygous dominant for that offspring's genotype for gene A. Or we could say that dad gives that gene A and mom gives that gene A, and we get a heterozygous offspring here mom could give that gene A and dad could give that gene A, and we'd have another heterozygous offspring. Or we could have one parent giving this recessive version of the gene and the other parent giving the recessive version of the gene, and we'd have a homozygous recessive individual. And then I'll fill out the second Punnett square following the same rules. Then I have to interpret what these squares mean. So, let's answer what are the chances of having yellow offspring first. Okay, so to get yellow, yellow is going to equal, let's see, we need to be expressing, if I look over here, if the bird expresses the dominant form of both gene A and gene B, it will be yellow. So, how many of these are expressing the dominant form of gene A? We've got 1, 2, 3 of our 4 for gene A. And we're going to multiply that by our odds of expressing the dominant form of gene B. So we'll have 1, 2, 3 out of the 4 for gene B. The odds of expressing both in one individual, we find that just by multiplying the odds of each. So 3 times 3 is 9, and 4 times 4 is 16. So it's a 9/16 chance of yellow offspring. Okay, how about, let's see here. Could I get, the question also asks, what are the chances of producing green offspring? Well, to get green, let's see, if the bird expresses the recessive form of protein A and the dominant form of protein B, the bird's feathers will be green. All right, so let's work the green situation. The odds of getting green equal, they need recessive of protein A. So they got to express the recessive. These ones have a recessive allele, but they won't express it because the dominant always gets expressed over the recessive if both are present. The only one that's going to express the recessive is this one. So it's a 1 out of 4 chance of expressing the recessive form of gene A. And then to be green, they'd also have to express the dominant form of gene B, which would be a 3 out of 4 over here, which would give us a total of 3 out of 16. Okay. How about blue offspring? Well, that would mean that I'd have to produce, to get a blue offspring, I'd have to express the dominant form of protein A and the recessive form of protein B. 3 out of the 4 do dominant, express the dominant form of gene A, and 1 out of 4, this one right here, expresses the recessive form of gene B. So that's a 3 out of 16. And then finally, if we want to know how many red birds we would get, well, to get a red bird, we'd have to have the recessive form, both gene A and gene B, and it's only 1 out of 4 that would express the recessive form of gene A, and 1 out of 4 that would express the recessive form of gene B. So to figure out the odds of expressing both of those, we would take 1/4 times 1/4, and you would get 1 out of 16. All right. So that's it. That's how we work one of these multiple allele problems. You just take the odds of each event happening and multiply them together to figure out the odds of both traits occurring in one individual. That's it.